Hi, everybody. My name is Vien Truong. I'm the co-founder of Equity. We regularly advise lawmakers, universities, foundations, and organizations to develop an inclusive workforce, creating sustainable economies and equitable environmental policies. As an Oakland native, I've spent over a decade working on policies to both poverty and pollution, helping to pass policies that have moved over $5 billion from big polluters to underserved communities. Most recently, I helped to lead the Biden-Harris Climate Engagement Advisory Council and staff the California Business Jobs Recovery Task Force. I'm here to invite a panel discussion around the new deals that we need now, green, red, and blue. Although the New Deal of the 1930s rescued many from poverty and laid a foundation for a social safety net, it was also deeply flawed. It excluded Black Americans and many people of color from its programs. As the vision for a Green New Deal to tackle the climate emergency and restructure our economy evolves, it's imperative that we avoid the errors of the past. The rising calls for a Red New Deal, inclusive of Native Americans, and a Blue New Deal for threatened oceans and coastal communities rising. This conversation is rising. And in this truly original and dynamic session, we're going to talk about these emergent, interweaving movements and with some of our thought leaders. So first up, we'll have Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, a Brooklyn native, marine biologist, and policy expert. She is an expert and a founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank focused on the future of coastal cities. She's the co-editor of the best-selling anthology, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for a Climate Crisis. She's also co-founder of the All We Can Save Project, a new nonprofit to support women climate leaders. She's also the co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet. Her mission is to build a community around solutions for our climate crisis. We also have Sakawis. She's a member of the Plains Cree Saulteaux George Gordon First Nation in Canada and grew up in the city of Winnipeg. But she's been living in Iowa City for over 15 years now. She's a dedicated activist who writes, speaks, and organizes extensively on Indigenous, climate, environmental, and political issues. She founded the Great Plains Action Society in 2015. Sakawis holds a master's degree in religious studies from the University of Iowa and is a mom of three. Finally, we have Julian Brave NoiseCat. He's a vice president of policy and strategy at Data for Progress. He's narrative change director for the Natural History Museum. A fellow of the Type Media Center and NDN Collectiv, his work has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and other publications. He grew up in Oakland, California, where I did as well, and is a proud member of the Cannon Lake Band Takaskan, descendant of the Lil'wat Nation of Mount Currie. So please help me welcome them. Yay, everybody. Thanks for joining this conversation. It's so good to see you guys. I am truly honored and blessed, I feel like, to be here. And now I just want to shut up and hand the mic to you guys, starting with Dr. Ayana Johnson. I read your bio, but would love to have people hear more about your story and what brings you to this work.
Thank you for asking. I think, ironically, as a Brooklyn native, I didn't realize that New York was a coastal city until I had a PhD in marine biology and moved back and saw that we had nearly 600 miles of coastline spread across the 5 boroughs of New York City. And so, and that the ecosystem was still quite alive and vibrant. I mean, we have whales in New York Harbor. We have seahorses living under piers in the Hudson River. And there's still so much work worth doing here when it comes to ocean conservation. So, after having worked in the Caribbean for nearly a decade, I found myself thinking about cities in the US and what the future would look like given the projected impacts of climate change, from sea level rise to heat waves to storms. And realizing that we're simply not prepared. So the policy think tank you mentioned, Urban Ocean Lab, is my project that I've created to focus on that, to think about what is the policy framework that we need. How do we envision and design what the future looks like for coastal cities, and then create the policy frameworks that will enable us to have that future. And through that nonprofit think tank, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Julian and the team at Data for Progress, thinking specifically about offshore wind energy and what it would look like to accelerate that industry in US waters, which is already flourishing in, for example, the UK and other parts of Europe, as one of the elements for getting to 100% clean energy by 2035, which is now the Biden-Harris administration's goal. So I come at this work as a Brooklyn kid, as a marine biologist, as a policy nerd, as someone who cares deeply about justice, and is really thinking about the intersections. You also mentioned my work with All We Can Save, the anthology, and the All We Can Save project, which is the nonprofit that has grown out of that, to carry forward the work of the book, to think about how we build community around climate solutions. How do we continue to elevate the voices of women climate leaders and women of color in particular? How do we support financially these leaders? So we're working on creating what I sort of jokingly call the Climate Genius Award, which we hope to launch late next year. And, you know, I think all of this sort of grows out of how I see myself as a person and like how I think I can be useful, which is something that's certainly evolving. But all the work that I do, including the podcast, is really focused on climate solutions. We've had, you know, decades of media focusing on the problem, and now there's a real need and opportunity to say, like, what now? What do we do? We have the vast majority of Americans who are like, we get it, this is a problem, but like, what do you want us to do? And what are you going to do? What is government going to do? What are corporations going to do? So that's how kind of I see this moment in history as one where we really need to spend a lot of time on visioning and philosophy. And so I'm really honored to be a part of this panel with two people who are thinking very deeply about what the future should look like.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm a fan of all of your work. One of the things that stuck out for me in watching one of your talks recently was the importance of being proximate to the problem in order to truly understand the solutions. And that's something I think that all of you share in common. Sakawis, I'd love to hear your sharing a little bit about the work that you've been doing. I know you've been working from the pipelines to making sure we're standing up for Iowa, making sure that we're really representing Indigenous communities. Can you say a little bit about what brought you to this work and what you're doing now?
I guess, you know, at the base of it, being Indigenous is what brought me to this work. Growing up in Winnipeg, my first science project, I think in grade 3, was on acid rain, and I, you know, just linked it to what they're doing to what it was doing into Indigenous communities, and I didn't realize at the time that was even important. But I started organizing at the age of 19 in New Brunswick to, you know, help Indigenous communities fight the extreme racism they're facing in the fisheries industry, and continued on that path. And here I am. I've founded my own organization, which is doing very well, out of a need to bring to light the truth about what's happening in Iowa in terms of the big ag crisis and the mass pollution of our waterways, and what it's doing to the Mississippi and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. Iowa is the #1 contributor to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and you know, propaganda basically tells a lie. And so, you know, and then pipelines, yes, that's definitely been part of my work. But in general, it's about it's about understanding the mindset right now that has caused us to bring us to this climate crisis. And, you know, concerning the Green New Deal, you know, AOC has stated that the climate change and our environmental challenges are the biggest existential threats to our way of life right now. But, you know, I disagree, because I can see why she might say this, but from my perspective, the view is short-sighted. Like, you know, as the biggest existential crisis is actually colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples around the world, which has given rise to, you know, a global Christian Muslim elite ruling class perpetuating colonial capitalism and that is the cause of the climate crisis. And so my work fundamentally focuses on colonial capitalism from every aspect that I work from it, from, you know, understanding why we have such high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous people, yes, to fighting, you know, the KXL or DAPL pipelines, to my work on big ag and CAFOs, concentrated animal feed operations in Iowa, to pretty much everything. So that's really what my work you know, surrounds, and that's what I'm actually writing about at the moment. Hopefully, to get something like that published in the near future.
Very cool. If we could just spend 1 second more on this, because I heard that your title on your business card is decolonizer.
Yeah, before
can you say what that means?
Yeah.
Wait, you got to say a little bit about that.
So as an academic, you know, I was asked to provide a title for myself, and I really couldn't think of one, because I'm trying to move our organizing methodologies more into the ways of our traditional societies, and so getting away from these hierarchies, and moving towards, you know, hive-mindedness, and so I was like, I know, you know, I'm technically, you know, the executive director of Great Plains Action Society, but, you know, that's just a term I use for funders. You know, really in my heart, like, I really think that the world needs to decolonize, which I will talk about more actually in this talk. So yeah, that's where that comes from. I thought long and hard, and that's essentially what I do at the very end of the day. I do everything, but that's what I'm trying to do.
As soon as I heard it, I was so inspired. I was like, yes, I want to be in your class. And I definitely want to be reading your book. Let's pick up with you, Julian. Can you say a little bit more about the work that you've been doing and what brings you to this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Big fan of Vien and Ayana, who mentioned that we've had the opportunity to work a little bit together on some offshore wind policies that we've sent to members of Congress and the press and things like that. Also really excited to meet Sakawis, and just want to acknowledge that, you know, usually when we're at Bioneers, I guess we're all usually in Marin. So I don't know whose traditional territory the internet technically is, but Marin is Coast Miwok territory. I just want to acknowledge that. How to describe what I do? So I run a startup think tank called Data for Progress, where I'm the vice president of policy and strategy. I was the first employee on staff, and have now helped build up the team into more than 10 people, number of whom I manage directly. And we basically, what we do from a technical perspective is that we pair rapid, accurate, and cost-effective public opinion research, so polling, basically the market research, if you will, behind politics, with sort of the traditional policy analysis, policy development, research, white papers of a think tank, and then we marry that together with we get a lot of media. So we have a large Twitter following, and then we also, our work gets cited quite a bit in the press. And we've used those skill sets to help build out sort of the vision for progressive policies, and in particular for the Green New Deal. And we had the opportunity to work with Senator Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, on the first piece of actual Green New Deal legislation, which was the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. So yeah, it's a very exciting area of work, one where we hope to not just be writing messaging bills and hopefully actually making policy very soon with the incoming Biden administration. And of course, with sort of the crisis of climate change, of inequality, of racial injustice, all these other things, you know, it's a very essential area of policymaking, and it's very humbling to be in the mix and influencing some of that, you know, when you're a young guy like me.
And I will say, I remember the last conversation we had, it was at a meeting. I remember the first discussion was who would make a better senator, E40 or Tupac Amaru Shakur. where it was like a very serious policy conversation. But I want to maybe pick up where you last left off around policy. We're here to talk about what the New Deal looks like, what the future of America has to look like. But in order to go forward, we got to know our past. And can you tell us a little bit about where this term, the New Deal, even comes from, and what the idea is behind the Green New Deal? And Julian, if you can help us with that one. And anybody else afterwards, please do feel free to add.
Yeah, so I at one point in time wanted to be a historian, actually, and then the 2016 election happened, and I realized that graduate school was maybe not the best use of my time, and the archive was not the best use of my time. But so the New Deal, I should say, as a almost historian one time, was a set of government programs whose scope is actually debated, and whose impacts are widely recognized as being very formative in the development of sort of the United States modern history. The New Deal was shaped by sort of two crises that were occurring in the 1930s. The first was, of course, the Great Depression. And the New Deal is probably best remembered as a set of social programs, spending on infrastructure, reforms, et cetera, that were designed to basically build out the beginnings of a modern welfare state here in the United States, and to get the economy back on its feet after the Great Depression, or amidst the Great Depression. It's largely credited for creating the white middle class in this country, although, of course, things like the mortgage, which came out of actually New Deal policies, excluded, for example, Black Americans. Was also designed, we should add, in part to fight the rise of anti-democratic sort of sentiments and movements around the world. Of course, in the 30s, you also had things like the rise of fascism in Europe, which was also very much sort of on the public conscious, and something that policymakers were thinking about at the time. The Green New Deal, which of course has yet to be actually achieved at federal policy levels, although there are some states and localities that are pursuing sort of Green New Deal style policies right now, was conceived, or is conceived, as a similarly broad governing program that is supposed to take on the multiple crises that we face today. First, of course, the climate crisis, which I'm sure folks at Bioneers are very aware of the situation that we face on climate change. But I think it's worth just adding that, the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere that we have right now is the highest that we've ever had and ever faced as a species. And the last time that there was about 410 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, there were forests on Antarctica. The Greenland ice sheet did not exist, and sea levels were 50 feet plus higher than they were today. So this is a really unprecedented ecological crisis that we're living through. Of course, we also have the crisis of inequality. Not only is global inequality the highest that it's been in about 100 years, here in the United States, we have the greatest inequality of any of the G7 countries. If you look at our Gini coefficient, for example. And we also similarly have crises of rising hate, and also sort of anti-democratic, authoritarian sentiments, not just here through President Trump and his movement, but also globally. And I think that it's fair to say, as someone who's been slightly involved in the Green New Deal, that the hope, at least with sort of the conception of some of these policy ideas that are out there, and also many of which are still being developed, is that it would be a robust program to take on all of these challenges, and to similarly build the kind of resilient welfare state and economy that we need amidst climate change in the 21st century and moving forward.
Thank you. I literally can sit in all your classes and be happy all day. Julian, you just
I would add one thing to that, in case folks aren't familiar with the actual Green New Deal itself as written down on paper, because people often think it either is a bill that already exists and maybe has been passed, or it hasn't been often so perfectly explained in the media. So it is a resolution of Congress that was introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey in the two chambers of Congress. It has probably nearly 200 co-sponsors. So this is not like AOC's thing. It actually is a very well supported congressional resolution. And it's 14 pages long, double spaced with like pretty large font. So I thought it was going to be hundreds of pages, but really anyone can read it in about 5 minutes. And as Julian was describing, it lays out essentially a vision for what would it look like for a robust federal mobilization to address the climate crisis at the scope and scale that science tells us is required. Like, how would we actually get to zero emissions by 2050? How would we reform not just energy, but also agriculture and transportation? What would it look like to ramp up green jobs? How could we make sure people have healthcare and other services during this transition? So it really is like a super sweeping vision. I just wanted to put that out there because I think a lot of what people understand the Green New Deal to be has been like filtered through some like honestly crappy media distillations. And so I think there is a debate to be had about like whether these are the exact programs and we can't do them all at once. What do we need to prioritize? But if people don't know what's in there, we can't have that public discourse happening. So I just wanted to put in a plug for people actually taking a few minutes to sit down and read it and think about whether or not you agree with all of it or part of it, what's really in there, and what you think that means for the priorities for the incoming administration.
So important. So important, because I think it has been used by the right as kind of like a fear tactic, right? But it really was supposed to tee up and open up a conversation.
And as Julian just probably knows better than anyone, the polling initially was that like everyone was for it. They were like, New Deal, that seemed to be good for America. You know, in hindsight, Green New Deal, majority support from both parties until there was like a very specific campaign to sort of spread misinformation about what was in there and discredit the premise. And that was unsurprisingly an initiative led by Fox News. And so as you saw that press increase, you saw support from conservatives decrease, but everyone was initially like, sure, more clean energy sounds good. Yes, more green jobs, but like we need those everywhere. So just to put a little more context to that, like this is actually quite a popular program.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that I want to kind of lean in a little bit on there is it opened also the beginnings of a conversation of what do we have and what are we missing? And you helped to tee up the creation of the Blue New Deal. Can you help us understand what is the Blue New Deal? How did it come about? And what should we understand about it?
Yeah, so when I did the part where I was reading the document, I got to page 10 before I saw the first mention of the ocean. And as someone who's spent a career studying marine ecology and the role that the ocean plays in the climate system, I was like, oh boy, this is just not gonna cut it, right? Like it's not gonna be successful if we leave out the ocean. And the ocean was listed as like, things we should protect include kind of like as just a list of different, parts of nature.
Almost like dismissive, like in passing.
Yeah, sort of in passing and without any sort of granularity as to what that would entail. And so obviously I was not the only ocean focused person who noticed this. So I started having this conversation with colleagues, like what would it look like if the ocean were included within the framework of a Green New Deal? And so that sort of like the first iteration of that thinking, we presented as an op-ed called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal that I co-authored with Bren Smith, a former fisherman who's now a regenerative ocean farmer who has spoken at Bioneers before. And I think probably launched his book here, Eat Like a Fish. His nonprofit is called Green Wave, which is training a whole generation of ocean farmers and trying to jumpstart that industry in a way that actually supports communities and makes sense. We can get agriculture right in the ocean. We haven't screwed it up yet. So let's do that. And then with Chad Nelson, who's the CEO of Surfrider Foundation, which is the largest grassroots ocean conservation group in the US with chapters all along the coastlines. And so the three of us put our heads together and said, like, okay, like what would the main things be if the ocean were included in this? And number one was offshore renewable energy. Right now, that's primarily offshore wind. The next was simply protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, because we know that wetlands, for example, can absorb around 5 times more carbon per acre than a forest on land. So we talk a lot about trees. We don't talk nearly enough about mangroves or marshes. And those coastal ecosystems are also the physical barrier that are protecting us from storms, from surges, from to some degree sea level rise. So and are way cheaper than building seawalls around everything, right? And also are the nursery habitat for fishery species. So Sakawis, I was really excited to hear you mention your work with fishing communities. It seems like there's some overlap in our areas of focus there. So I think we also talked about obviously regenerative ocean farming, which is Bren's, the work that he's pioneering, and what would it look like to develop an industry around algae biofuel, which is that thing that always is like about to happen, but like hasn't yet actually happened. And so we sort of highlighted those as 4 major opportunities, and also offered the context that the ocean has, already absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide we've emitted by burning greenhouse gases, and over 90% of the heat that we've trapped with those greenhouse gases, right? So to forget about the ocean when we're talking about climate policy is just simply a recipe for failure, because it is a major driver of our climate system. So how can we keep that in mind? And so the Blue New Deal sort of like started with that first op-ed, then connected with Data for Progress and Julian. We developed a policy memo around blue jobs, the opportunity of sort of like the blue economy and how that could be a significant part of it. And then Bren got brave and decided to ask a question at the CNN Climate Town Hall during the Democratic primary that just happened to be directed toward Elizabeth Warren, and essentially was like, I'm a fisherman, I'm an ocean farmer, like I think we need a Blue New Deal that includes, coastal communities. And she immediately was like, yes, we need that. And then probably a week later, her Maggie Thomas from her policy team, who's her climate advisor, called me and was like, so apparently my boss committed to a Blue New Deal on national television. Will you help me write a plan for that? And so I had the opportunity to collaborate with the Warren campaign on like the Blue New Deal plan. And since she left the race, there's been a lot of work to make sure those ideas are carried forward no matter who is in charge. And so the Biden administration has actually been thinking about and incorporating some of those ideas. And I've had the opportunity to speak with the transition team and sort of like mention these things as the work proceeds. So I'm really excited about what's possible with the new administration as far as carrying forward not just Blue New Deal concepts, and just to reiterate, the Blue New Deal is designed to be complementary, not at all in conflict with the Green New Deal, but sort of an addendum, if you will. I think what we've seen in this electoral cycle with a primary that became a race for who had the best climate policy, and that actually continued during the general, with Biden actually like upping his commitments at a time when most candidates are sort of like moving towards the middle. He said, actually 2050 is not soon enough for clean energy. I'm going for 2035 and committing to 40% of the resources for climate adaptation in particular going to disadvantaged communities, and protecting 30% of nature by 2030. Like, these are massive goals, and it's going to take all of us to hold the administration accountable to the speed and magnitude of what it's going to take to make that happen, for the ocean in particular, which often sort of gets relegated to the sidelines because of just by virtue of being out of sight and out of mind. But there's a lot of opportunity there that we're missing if we don't remember sort of the salty parts of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, by the way, to create the Blue New Deal. It's so important, and thank you for flagging it. Thank you for helping us to write a Blue New Deal.
Yeah. It was a
Yeah.
great opportunity to contribute, but there's a lot of cooks in that kitchen doing great work. It's certainly not just me by any stretch.
I love that Maggie Thomas came into the story too, because I love her as well.
She's the best.
She's the best. Let's bring in Sakawis, because one of the conversations we're having is like, what was missing historically in the conversation of creating this new future? And Indigenous communities, whose occupied lands we are all on, has been too often left out of the conversation in the rebuild of what this future has to look like. Can you help us kind of bring into the conversation around what it is that we need to understand of the reality right now faced by Indigenous communities, and what do we have to do to honor the pain and the long history of hurt that we have to heal from and bring forward in order to do right by Indigenous communities?
You know, I was glad to see that the Green New Deal, did, give a nod to us a handful of times. Referring to our sovereignty, prior and informed consent, and, which is a term used by the UN, which is nice to see. But I'm a cynic, and I have to be a cynic because, as we know, a lot of words and are not followed up by actions in this country. In particular, when it comes to, actually adhering to treaties, actually uplifting Indigenous sovereignty, and actually listening to what Indigenous people have to say and have had to say and are doing for a very long time. I think I think the problem with the Green New Deal is that it also and still perpetuates the ideals of colonial capitalism. It does not actually get to the heart of the matter, which is that Christian-led colonial capitalism is killing us. Regardless of political affiliation, when we get to the apex of governance in this country, like the focus becomes one and the same: protect the economy at all costs. But that's not just making sure that Americans have jobs. It's about protecting the ongoing project of Manifest Destiny to make sure that the U.S. stays a world power, and that the ideals of this country, that this country was founded upon, remain the dominant narrative. And, what are these ideals, right? What are these ideals that this country has been founded upon? The idea of Manifest Destiny is to civilize and expand and increase patriotism to an imperialist system for the sake of freedom and liberty. And, but for whose freedom and whose liberty are we talking about? We all know, how this country was founded. We all know that it was founded at the point of a gun for the sake of free land and labor, on the bodies of Black and Brown folks. And unfortunately, that sentiment is built into the foundation of this government, which also directs our economic institutions and our economic interests, I guess is what I want to say. So, the economy is founded upon the idea that God gave man dominion over the earth. And that is essentially, why the Green New Deal may not succeed, because it's fundamentally still making many concessions to perpetuate the same economic system, but just with an environmental front on it. And so, like, in the end, the Green New Deal is still about profit and not about absolute system-wide reform, which is, what I feel, people that have written about the Red New Deal are trying to say. In the end, we have to ask ourselves, like, how do we define the idea of profit? How do we redefine the idea of profit moving forward? Because the Green New Deal is still a colonial capitalist system.
Yeah, I want to then ask a question of what then is the ways that we can make sure that as we rebuild this future. This is a question that the audience raised, and I want to kind of bring it a little early here, is how do we then make sure that we're truly creating a process and a product that centers and prioritizes people of color and Indigenous people moving forward? And anyone, feel free to answer that question.
I could continue, I guess. We need to, like I said, we need to redefine what profit means to the society by ushering in an Indigenous-minded economy. So last year at Bioneers, I referred to a quote by Pio Pio Mox Mox, a Walla Walla chief, who said in 1855 that goods and the earth are not equal. Goods are for use on the earth. You cannot give goods in exchange for land. And, I wholeheartedly, believe this, and I live by this. Indigenous peoples the world over were genocided because of this type of thinking, because it is a threat to the colonial capitalist enterprise of predatory, economics. And I know these are very basic understandings of, what how the world is moving right now. But in the end, I still feel like these are the hard conversations that people don't want to have, and that governments really need to start having as well, and in terms of how they're moving, where they're moving, and like what does the Green New Deal actually entail? Is it just a perpetuation of the same thing packaged differently, or is it really getting to understanding why we ended up in this place in the first place?
Yeah. Dr. Johnson, you seem like you were going to say something there.
I was going to say sort of like the boring, obvious thing in response to your question, like how do we center people of color, Indigenous people, disadvantaged communities more broadly, is that we just do it. Like, I think we often like want to overcomplicate these things. Like, what is the 18-step process to like caring about other humans? Like, you just do it, right? Like, we just need to treat everyone as if their lives matter, as if their cultures matter, as if their histories matter, as if their, and I think the, sort of like the more historically disadvantaged, oppressed, sort of torn apart those communities have been, the greater the need to reverse that. So I think, of course, there are a million details, but I think it can start very simply by just saying like, we need to do it differently and better this time. And the hard part of that is it requires giving up power, requires giving up money. It requires some people stepping back to make room for other people to step forward. As my co-founder of the All We Can Save project and co-editor of the anthology, Catherine Wilkinson, often says the climate crisis is a leadership crisis, right? We clearly have not had the leaders that we need, which is why we are in this mess. And so we need to make room for more leaders. And in the way that the movement for Black Lives is really focused on being a leaderful movement, having leaders in every city, in every region, having a distributed network of leaders. That is, I think, what has been missing. One of the things that has been missing from the climate movement is, allowing it to be a movement that focused on a small handful of privileged white men as if they had all the answers, which is just, it's literally impossible, right? Like we need to draw from the full spectrum of brilliance on the planet. And I think that therein lies the opportunity, because this is a crisis that will require leaders in every community leading their communities in the transition to a regenerative future. And we can't have all of that sort of like decreed from on high and outside. That has to be done in the context of the places and the ways in which people live. And so at a sort of like basic level, I see this as an opportunity to say, like, do we want to win? Like if it's us versus climate catastrophe, which is like, we're not actually fighting with nature, but like, let's suspend the metaphor flaws for a moment. Like if we want to succeed at addressing the climate crisis, it's going to take everyone. So like, let's just make some more room. And the hard part again, is that like some people will need to step back and like let go of control, even when you're giving away money, right? Like philanthropy is obviously broken.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too, about philanthropy. I just quickly want to say something very quick, and then I'll be quiet for a while. What you said is so
Don't be
perfect.
quiet. We need you.
Yeah,
Talk about leadership.
I just got excited because you're right. I've been organizing Indigenous at SOCAP for 3 years now, trying to get people with money to change, how they're investing, because, even then, where money meets meaning, that's the saying of SOCAP. It's still about like where I can make money, but like feel good about it. and so like that's what I keep saying, changing the idea of profit. Like, how much profit do you need to be happy in life? How much money do you need? At what point are you like, comfortable? And so that's and so besides just impact investing, right? We still need to focus heavily on philanthropy, because like right now, like the flow of capital is the status quo, right? And we need to upend the political system and the economic system so that we can change that, because the majority of philanthropic funds, goes primarily to white-led organizations, which perpetuates injustice, like you're just saying. Like the First Nations Development Institute did a study between 2006 and 2014 and found that only 0.6% of foundation funds went towards Indigenous peoples, Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous issues. And so 95%, let's just say, of $60 billion each year in the US that's given away goes mostly towards white-led organizations. And this is an interesting statistic because it correlates with the fact that the majority of land in this country is owned by white men, which is 95%. And so I really thought that was important to add to what you were saying, because that is essentially still the issue. The cycle of money is still just, flowing in one direction. And I see us implementing the Green New Deal, and I still see that happening. And that's where we need to have that hard conversation.
Yeah. Julian, anything to add here?
Yeah, so in my work and writing, I've had the opportunity to go all over North America and see various Indigenous communities who are building alternatives, more or less like outside of the colonial capitalist system, however you want to put it. I have had the opportunity to go visit the New Hulk Nation in Bella Coola, British Columbia, where they have revived their traditional hereditary governance system and are now, using that form of governance to, manage and control their lands in what is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in the world. I also got to witness and take part in the annual oral recitation, which lasts 7 days, of Guyana and Goa, which is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's oral constitution. It's also sort of their political origin story. It tells the story of a peacemaker who comes and unites the nations that are part of their confederacy. And every year for the last decade or so, those 6 nations have come together and recited that constitution. It's over 500 years old, and it's one of the oldest democracies in the world. At the same time, I work in Washington, D.C., and I think that we, as long as we have these systems of colonial settlement of racial capitalism, that we also have to work as effectively as we can through those systems to empower our people. Of course, I wouldn't work in policy in Washington, D.C. if I didn't also believe that at the same time. And so one of the other things that I've had the opportunity to be a part of is that earlier this summer, my think tank, Data for Progress, put out a project called the Progressive Cabinet Project, where we named a bunch of progressive folks who could potentially staff the next Democratic administration. And we included on that document Representative Deb Holland, who's of the Laguna Pueblo and the 1st Congressional District of New Mexico. And I'll be honest, I never thought that any of the names that were on that document were really going to go anywhere. It was really more of like a fantasy football style, like a bunch of lefty kids chose, our ideal White House cabinet. What would that look like? And to my, great surprise, in the months since, Representative Holland has emerged as one of the potential choices that Biden could make for Secretary of the Interior. And I think we can be honest about the limits of all these bureaucracies and the fact that they are not going to in one fell swoop deliver our people liberation. But at the same time, the Department of the Interior has, in its over 150 years of existence, never had a Native person at its helm, even though it manages public lands, natural resources, and Indian affairs. It's worth pointing out that those lands and those resources were also taken from Native people. And there's also never been a Native cabinet secretary in the entire history of this country. There's been over 750 cabinet secretaries in United States history, and not a single one has been one of the first peoples of this country. And so I think that while I 100% am supportive of efforts to build alternatives outside of these systems. There's a very great one actually in my hometown in the Bay Area called the Segoria Tay Land Trust that is reclaiming Ohlone land in the Bay. At the same time, I think that these systems are going to continue to exist for some time, and they have inflicted incredible harm on people. With respect to Indigenous peoples, these are the systems that perpetuated a genocide against us. With respect to Black people, these are the systems that perpetuated slavery and then perpetuated segregation and still perpetuate those systems to this day. And I do believe that putting the right people in those places, Elizabeth Warren, one of my favorite policymakers, says that personnel is policy, can make a small measure of difference. And so I'm really hopeful that at the same time as my people continue to build alternatives outside of these systems, that we get the right people in there and that they fight the right fights from inside as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that I was blessed to be able to work with Congresswoman Deb Holland as part of the climate surrogates during the campaign. And we got to meet her. We had meetings every Thursday, and she is fabulous and absolutely amazing leader. And I 1000% just think that the DOI would be in good hands with her. I want to maybe bring in a different side of this equation. Not only do we need to have right leadership, we also need to have right responsibility. Last year, I testified in Congress and talked about the importance of supporting a green economy, creating good jobs, that kind of stuff. And then a Republican congressman said, I don't believe in regulation. I believe in a free market society. I don't think we should regulate the industries at all. I got on a plane right after that, and I flew to a conversation with 500 CSOs with Fortune 500 companies and talked about, we need you guys to step up. I just talked to some Republican congressmen, and they said they don't believe in regulating you guys. You guys need to do your job. And their response was, we don't have CEOs that believe in it. We don't have enough of a budget. We don't have enough of staff. We can't be behind our competitors. I'd love to hear from you guys around how do we solve this impasse? And what do you guys think might be the role and responsibility of companies or corporations?
We do not have a free market. I think we need to start there. Like, that is a fantasy. And so to assume that the current scenario is a free market is nonsense. And that regulation added on to that would make it less free is also nonsense. And I think two things come to mind based on the way that you framed that question. One is we heavily subsidize a lot of things in this country. Two in particular, I think, are important to call out in this context: fossil fuel industry to the tune of many billions of dollars a year, and industrial agriculture also to the tune of many billions of dollars a year. And those subsidies not only imbalance the market, making it much harder for renewable energy and regenerative agriculture to gain a larger foothold in their sectors, they're also obviously killing the planet, right? So the fact that Biden is committed to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, I think, is an important step, but we need to think about in general what we're subsidizing. This is, another area in which Julian and I Julian and I ended up collaborating was around this concept of like, what is a green recovery from the recession created by the horrific management of this pandemic. If we're spending all this money on stimulus, why don't we spend it on creating a regenerative future instead of propping up failing industries like the fossil fuel industry, in which in many cases like cannot make a profit without government subsidies. So I just wanted to start by saying that, like, peel back the nonsense that we have a free market, because a lot of the stuff that's bad for the planet is being heavily subsidized by taxpayer dollars. And so that's the first thing I would say to that guy. The second thing is that I had an opportunity to have a short conversation with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. And what he describes as a big part of the problem is the only people that go to lobby around climate on the Hill are people who want less regulation and want the government to do less on climate. He was like, the good guys never come. And so all we hear from are people who want less regulation, but if the corporations who actually like have all of these mission statements and climate goals, we're going there too and saying, we actually need you to do more. You, federal government, are behind what we are committing to as a company. And like that makes it harder for us to compete in the market because you're a laggard. There's a lot of power in that. So I think, yeah, the good guys need to speak up. And we need to be honest with ourselves about like the actual structure of our current economy.
I love that. Julian Stakowis, our local decolonizer. How do we make companies step
up? We need to continuously be at the front lines. Unfortunately, that's a big part of change in this country. Indigenous folks, Black folks, Latinx folks have been at the front lines for centuries already doing that work. And that's a term now that I see becoming much more popular, especially since this past summer with the BLM uprisings. And I mean, that's the kind of work that needs to be done, unfortunately, because the system is just too corrupt to make that change internally. Not saying that I don't love what Julian just said about Deb Holland. I'm a huge fan of Deb Holland also, getting that position as Interior Secretary, because I think that's highly, highly important, but that we need to continually push from the outside as well. And, unfortunately, again, that comes back to, having the funding to do that work. And, we don't. And foundations that are trying to do, good need to start, changing it up a lot so that, for instance, in particular, right now I see 501c4s as a really viable solution moving forward, because they can make that precarious link between, nonprofit community organizing and real political change, because, they are allowed to, lobby and speak on behalf of candidates and, push forward an agenda that a 501c3 can't. And so, there's like things like that, which, seem kind of boring, but, are highly important to making that change, because if we are subdued by what the IRS might do to us if we speak out of turn, that's not okay. But at the same time, we need to be able to do this work. Tribal entities, our First Nations, they also need, more of a seat at the table at everything. I have this pipe dream where one day, all sovereign nations will have a seat in Congress and a voting seat. I mean, that's a little bit far-fetched, but I was really excited, for instance, when Kim Teehee was nominated to be what would you say? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting my words all of a sudden. Was nominated to be the representative of the Cherokee Nation in Congress based upon a treaty that was passed a long time ago. And of course, there's going to be litigation around that, and it won't be a voting seat. But that's a start. So that's how I feel about that.
Nice. Julian, I want to make sure we get your voice in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, I fully agree with what Ayana said and Sakawa said. You know, the free market is mostly a fiction, and you know, especially when you talk about the energy sector, this is a highly monopolized industry, wherein any sort of notion of a free and competitive market is quickly belied by the truth of how those markets operate. I also fully agree with what Sakawa was saying about resourcing organizations on the front lines, and you know, I feel very fortunate to be affiliated also with NDN Collectiv, which is an organization that regrants a good deal of money and is sort of oriented towards building power for Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. And you know, I think the thing that I would add here, just sort of orienting around the question of markets and ideology on these questions. You know, I often think about an essay that really helped me originally sort of start conceptualizing climate change as a policy issue, that was written by my friend and colleague Bill McKibben, wherein he pointed out that you know, if there were other industries like, say, restaurants or retail stores that were able to pollute freely, right? Like the central issue here is that you know, fossil fuel corporations and major industries that contribute greenhouse gas emissions are essentially dumping their waste into everyone's, you know, common area, everyone's streets, everyone's planet. And unlike other businesses, you know, they don't have to account for or pay for any of that. And that's not necessarily an endorsement of sort of ideas about the social cost of carbon or anything like that. You know, that's not actually my preferred decarbonization policy, but I guess we could get into that maybe later. But I think it is illustrative of the fact that this is a fairly unique market situation, if you want to go with that kind of a framing, wherein I don't think we're talking so much about, you know, the free market and whether or not these folks need to be regulated, but we're talking more about the failure of the market and the unique opportunity that fossil fuel corporations and big polluters are given to, you know, not pay for their waste in the same way that everybody else does.
Mm-hmm. I want to maybe look at the other end of this equation around corporations and the economy, which is more around from the people side of things, poverty side of things. Even before the pandemic, most Americans did not have $600 in their savings account. According to the Columbia University, 8 million people slipped into poverty in the last 6 months. Just under 900,000 people filed for unemployment last week. There's a question that we have from the audience member about what can career and technical education organizations do to support and engage in the green, red, and blue deals. I want to just maybe add to it, if you want to enter the conversation or the discussion in another way, which is, what's the role that we can have in these red, green, and blue deals around creating opportunities for people who are now suffering?
You're muted.
Thank you for bringing that into the conversation, because I think it's critically important that we acknowledge that we are at a particularly sort of gruesome moment in American history as regards inequality in this country. At like the amount of wealth in this nation and the extent to which it is unevenly distributed is like disgusting. That we have, you know, billionaires who have made a fortune while everyone else has been falling this last year. And, you know, so many people without healthcare, so many people without jobs, so many people losing their homes as we enter winter, especially. And I think it is certainly important to look at how all of these social issues intersect with climate. And so I would like revisit what I mentioned before about the opportunity for a green recovery as we are, as we are in this transition to a new administration. And we, as Sakau has said, like, we're not going to assume they're going to do the right thing. There has to be persistent pressure. And where might we exert that pressure? What might that look like? How can we think about making sure people have homes, and also that there are, jobs to do green renovations, to make sure that homes are more energy efficient, to make sure that new construction is setting us on the right path when it comes to climate. It's been remarkable to see cities have to lead the way with a failure of leadership at the federal level when it comes to things like saying no new gas lines running into new constructions. Like, we're leaving fossil fuels in the past. We're not going to keep building that infrastructure. I'm not talking about pipelines, which is a whole other issue we need to deal with. And like, why are we still investing in building more infrastructure for something we're phasing out? But like the lines that create gas heat and cooking in our homes, like, we need to just stop building that stuff. When we think about putting people back to work, there's an opportunity to think about green jobs, about how are we training people for the new types of industries that are flourishing. We know that clean energy is the source of way more jobs than the fossil fuel industry, which has laid off well over 100,000 people in the last few months. The fossil fuel industry has, while even without getting large subsidies in the recovery packages, the renewable industry, energy industry is still hiring. So, I think one of the things that I'm really keen to see how it evolves is this concept that Jay Inslee proposed during the primary of a civilian climate corps, civilian conservation corps, which is again modeled on a New Deal program. But if we're putting people back to work, how do we put them back to work? We're protecting and restoring our ecosystems, which often get left out of the climate conversation, but are, what is sort of like, no matter if you think about things through the lens of traditional economics, natural resources are the foundation of our economy. We sort of like cannot exist without. So what does it look like to have that as the foundation of a green recovery? I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and the Biden administration picked up on this concept and included it in their updated climate plan. So that's something that I'll certainly be keeping an eye on as we think about, like, how are we recovering from this recession? What jobs are we providing for people? What role is the federal government playing? How can we make sure that the recovery policies don't further entrench inequality? I think there's obviously a lot of work to be done there. And I think about our food system too, right? My mother is a farmer upstate New York. From watching her sort of become a part of that sector over the last 2 decades and meeting her neighbors. She has a pension from being a school teacher, but it is nearly impossible to make ends meet while feeding your community. And that's totally insane. So to the extent that the Green New Deal, the Blue New Deal, the Red New Deal are also thinking about how we need to reform and overhaul our food system as part of this, how we're taking care of small farms and producers as part of this. I feel like I'm just listing things, but I mean, that's the problem with how insane a morass has been created, and that we now find ourselves in, is that we really have to deal with all of these like very major challenges at the same time.
Absolutely. The last 4 years, we've seen Trump pull us, not only step aside on the climate movement, but get us way backwards, back into, a valley that we have to dig ourselves out of in order for us to even catch up. And there's a lot of things you listed, Dr. Johnson, that we have to do. Julian and Sakau, what can we do in the Red, Green, and Blue New Deal to create more opportunities to bridge the inequalities that we're seeing now?
One thing that came to mind is Ayana. Am I pronouncing that right? Ayana? Ayana was speaking. Is the insidious nature of agribusiness or big ag, whatever you want to call it, and how it's rarely spoken about in terms of the severe impact it's had on the climate, and the social injustice it perpetuates, not just here, but around the world, especially around the world, actually. If you want to think of like the Zapatista movement, or people everywhere, like in the Philippines, rising up to protect themselves and even just feed themselves, rather than to feed other people with the food that they're growing on their traditional lands. And I would like to see some very robust language admitting the perpetuation of such egregious behavior. Colonial farming practices, in my opinion, are the worst thing that could have ever happened to us, and are huge consumers of fossil fuels as well. And so, just for instance, in Iowa, we were talking about regulation earlier. What came to mind is I think there are 7 or 8 counties in Iowa that are unregulated, that are high big ag counties, and that is because they need to dump and they need to pour whatever they can on these crops, so that they can get the most that they can out of it. And so I would like to see more talk about, checkerboarding on reservations due to, big ag and the serious issues that it's inflicting. These are also corporate conglomerates. So we're talking about big industry, right? That's what this is. And we need to start, I think, putting, as Indigenous people, more pressure on these types of organizations, and bringing to light like the disaster that they're perpetuating.
Nice. Julian, we got to hear from you on this.
So I'll try to synthesize this so that I don't talk at like 10-minute length. So firstly, I would say that the CARES Act was a very complicated piece of legislation, but I think it kind of revealed 2 things for me. The first is that in moments of crisis, when Congress actually decides to act, the sort of very rickety welfare state that we have in this country can actually on net be somewhat effective. If you look at the data and studies that came after the CARES Act, there was a period of time wherein the relief that was provided to families across the country and people across the country actually reduced real poverty rates. And so I think the question that raises for me is, why is it that if we have these tools at Congress's disposal, at the people who we elect's disposal, why is it that we don't use them unless we're in a historic pandemic recession? And why is it that they've been allowed to fall to such misuse? And then I think the second thing that this pandemic recession has brought out is that we have a social welfare system that's been neglected, but we have a very robust corporate welfare system, wherein at the exact same moment that the pandemic was hitting this country, devastating this country beginning in March, the CEOs of Chevron and ExxonMobil were actually getting White House meetings with President Trump. Just this week, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was scheduled to be opened up to drilling and leasing, at the exact same moment that Congress has yet to pass any meaningful, second round of relief legislation. At the same time is that opening up of what is considered sacred land to the Indigenous Gwich'in people, is also designed to actually pay for the last round of tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, which was the Trump 2017 tax cut bill. And basically, just to jog everyone's memory, because I know the last 4 years have gaslit all of us, the idea there was that part of the way that we were going to make the accounting work for all these tax cuts for billionaires and corporations was that we would open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling and leasing, to fossil fuel corporations, and that the revenue from that would help offset all of the lost revenue from the Treasury Department that would not be coming from very, very wealthy people. And so I think we have to look at that set of realities and recognize that these are purposeful choices, right? We choose, or not us, but our elected representatives choose to make sure that, corporations and the wealthy are well taken care of. And the way that they pay for that is either by, depriving people of the basic sort of social rights that we should all have as human beings. And also by, polluting recklessly and opening recklessly lands to, giant corporations. And I think the last point that I would add is that there's a really great paper from my colleague at the Roosevelt Institute, Rihanna Gunn-Wright, that is basically about stimulus and green stimulus. So this is the notion that stimulus should be, helping contribute to the fight against climate change. And the core argument that she makes is that all stimulus is climate policy. And I think that, there's this tendency to think about climate policy as this siloed set of, issues that are very narrowly targeted towards the energy sector or towards, reducing emissions in various sectors. But I think it's really helpful to think about all policies and all stimulus packages moving forward as being climate policy, in the sense that if they are not contributing to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change, then they are actually climate policy in the sense that they are deepening the hole in which we continue to dig ourselves into as a society and as an economy. And so we should start thinking about all of these bills and packages as climate policy, because they are each and every one of them offers an opportunity for us to start finally making headway on our growing climate deficit that we're in.
Nice. I see the time. We got 3 more minutes and 3 people. Last question. And most importantly, we talked a lot about kind of deep and serious stuff here today, but we got to remember we need hope in order to have action. As my favorite movie will say, some Star Wars, we billions are built on hope. So give me a little bit of what inspires you now, what gives you hope, and what do you want people to do with that? What action do you want people to do and take?
I know this is like maybe not playing the game appropriately, but I just disagree with the premise that we need hope in order to act. I act every day without any assumption that humanity or the United States is going to get its act together, because I think it is my responsibility as a human on this planet who understands the problems we face to contribute as much as I can to the solutions, even if it's a long shot, right? I mean, and as a scientist, what I see is all of the dire scientific projections, from temperature to sea level rise to ocean acidification to the loss of ecosystems and species, right? But what we see in those graphs is a trend line that gets, fuzzier and fuzzier as it goes up, because there's this range of possible futures that depends entirely on what we do. We, humanity, species, we. And I think that's what motivates me, is knowing that the future is not written, and so much certainly of climate impacts is already baked into the system. As Julian said, we're living in a moment where there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has ever been while humans have existed on this planet. So we're in uncharted territory, but in that same breath, I can remind myself that there is still a wide range of possible futures, and I can contribute to making sure we have the best possible one. And so that's what I would encourage everyone at Bioneers to do. You are here because you care. You are more well-informed than the majority of Americans on these topics, arguably. And so my question to you is, what is your superpower? We often ask everyone, when it comes to climate, when it comes to the environment, to do the same thing, right? Everyone protest and vote and donate and spread the word, and please continue to do all those things. But if we're not bringing our skills to the movement, to the work, then we're not going to succeed, right? Like if you are a web developer, if you are a lawyer, if you are a scientist, if you are a policy nerd, if you are a farmer, if you are an architect or an actor or someone who's really cool and people listen to, like we need you to bring those skills to this work as opposed to everyone doing the same thing. So what I've done, as I described with like how I formed Urban Ocean Lab, is like map the things you care about, the things you're good at, and the work that needs doing, and like, you know, and what brings you joy, and like figure out how you can make your greatest contribution at that intersection.
Nice. Sakawis.
I do this work because I love my people as an Indigenous person. And I've spoken to many groups of white folks about the doctrine of discovery or manifest destiny. And I often tell them that they need to do this work because they love their people, which means combating, the ideological warfare that's going on within this country, largely between, the majority population, which are white folks, on one side, and then the other. We're not going to be able to move forward like in Congress politically or economically if we have a whole segment of society that is pushing in the opposite direction. So I want to see, in particularly white privileged folks do what they need to do within their communities to make change and to make that ideology shift, because that's what it comes down to. It's like what is in the mass consciousness of people right now and what they want and how they want to live. And right now we're just perpetuating colonial capitalism, and we're going to keep doing that until we can make people understand that the earth is a living entity and that we need to treat it as such. And so that's what I will continue to do.
Thank you. Julian, NoiseCat, help us wrap up.
Yeah, two things real quick. There's one party in this country that believes climate change is happening and actually has some plans about what they want to do about it. And there's another party that does not have anything like that. The party that believes in the science has two candidates who are standing for election to the Senate in a runoff in Georgia. And I think that they could use their help. They could use your help. Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff. I think both have strong platforms, good people. But I think on a more deep level, I get to look at a lot of public opinion research, and one of the most troubling trends actually has nothing to do with politics at the end of the day that we see. It's actually the fact that if you look at survey data over a long period of time, people say that they don't trust their neighbors as much as they used to, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I think at the end of the day, those basic social ties, that one of the things that makes us human is the fact that we have compassion for each other, we create community, we can show solidarity and love to one another. I think that those are things that we can all control, and it is close to the holiday season. So I would say that underlying all these big heady questions about policy and politics and social change, et cetera, is just like what it means to be a good human and to be a good member of your community. I think those are things that we can all try to do a little bit more of every single day.
You all are amazing. I want to cheer you on. Thank you for leading on the red, green, and blue New Deal. I wish you all well, blessings, and happy holidays. And thank you for all your amazing work. Thank you, Bioneers.
Thank you, Bioneers.
Thank you, Bioneers. Thank you for moderating, Vien. You did a great job.
Thank you.